Welcome back to Revealing the Truth. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, your host. We have been spending a delightful morning talking to WorldNet Daily Book authors, both Michael Onifer about God, Israel, and You, and our good friend Pastor Carl Gallups was just with us, and now I get the opportunity of visiting again. You were on my radio show with me, and we are joined via Skype, doing the wonders of technology, from Bonnie Lake, Washington, Pastor Mark Biltz. Pastor Mark Biltz is best known up to this point as being the original author and discoverer of this connection of the four blood moons. And I had the wonderful opportunity of interviewing you then about decoding the eminent heavenly signs and how that's been playing out and continues to play out as we look at the prophetic significance. But you have a new release out called God's Daytimer, The Believer's Guide to Divine Appointments. And as you know, Mark is a Jewish man who's grown up celebrating the Moedim, the appointed times, having led a Messianic congregation and letting people know and asking them this question: if you had a doctor's appointment, would you keep it? And they always say yes. I said, well, if you had an appointment with God, would you keep it? And they said, well, sure, but I don't have an appointment with God. I said, how interesting, because He has an appointment with you. And He has set it up in His Word. And you have created in God's Daytimer, The Believer's Guide to Divine Appointments, a personal understanding for the Gentile believer to be able to embrace the full richness of the feasts, of the appointed times. And I want to caveat in my opening comments about this is that for those out there that are watching who think that this is Judaizing, this is the very thing that Paul wrote against, there is absolutely no intention on Pastor Mark's part to imply that salvation comes through observance of Jewish feasts, and they're not even Jewish feasts, and I'm going to take that right out of the conversation. These are God's feasts, not the Jewish people's feast. But that there is a certain amount of depth of understanding. If I want to know you, I'm going to go where you go. I'm going to worship like you worship. I'm going to pray like you pray. And I'm going to celebrate like you celebrate. And if I really want to know Jesus, then I'm going to go where He went. I'm going to do what He did. I'm going to pray like He prayed, and I'm going to celebrate like He celebrated. And this is that guidebook to an understanding of how to embrace and celebrate God's divine appointments. Pastor Mark Biltz, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's great being with you. I'm excited.
That's great. Great. Tell me, what was the real inspiration behind you writing this?
Oh my goodness. I would say because I believe every believer needs to realize they have an appointment with God. Just like you said, actually, He has one with each one of us.
Yes.
I mean, why in the world would we not want to be there? I ask people, would you want to be at the wedding of the Messiah? And they all say, yes, of course. And then I say, well, why wouldn't you want to be at the dress rehearsal? You know, because that's what's so important. And I really see that these feasts are appointed times when God was going to intersect human history. And just as He fulfilled all the spring feasts to the day of His first coming, He'll fulfill the fall feast to the day of His second coming. So these have such great relevance to believers today. I just felt compelled to let them know.
Well, it's extremely important that as a Jewish believer, many of these things I took for granted because these were the observances of my youth. These were the observances of my lifestyle. Is that Passover, first fruits, Pentecost, Shavuot, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, all these things, these Hebrew names, are for the very things that Jesus was found to be in Jerusalem for the Passover, as was his custom. And as disciples, Talmudim, his ones to be raised up to walk along the way, as it says in Deuteronomy. And in Hebrew, that's haderek, to walk along the way. When Jesus says, I am the way, I am haderek, the way, ha'emet, the truth, and l'chaim, the life, it draws us into an understanding that relationship with him means going where he goes, doing what he does, and enjoying the celebrations that, and these are all celebrations. They are markers. They are ancient. Many cases been replaced by Easter. Many cases been replaced by what Constantine did in the collapsing of the Jewish calendar into a calendar more relevant for him. But you take people and make them not be tourists in the kingdom of heaven, but be tour guides, equipping them for the fullness of the celebration of God's appointed times.
Well, thank you so much. To me, that's so important, because if I wanted to learn Chinese, I wouldn't go to Mexico to teach people about the Chinese. And I wouldn't go to China to teach people about Mexico. Well, it's the same thing. If you want to understand how Yeshua is Jewish, you have to go to Israel. You have to understand the Hebrew culture. How can I learn about the feasts or about Yeshua from an American culture? We have to understand it from the Jewish culture.
Exactly.
And so I want to be like a tour guide to the Jewish culture.
Well, when you read Zechariah 14, and we read the last lines of it, it says that the nations will be required to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem, beginning with the Feast of Tabernacles. And if they do not, God will withhold his rain. Is that physical rain, spiritual rain? It's rain from them in that season until they comply. Now, if you're a believer that you're going to be here when Jesus comes back, you are going to be required to make this pilgrimage. I would much rather do it voluntarily. I'd much rather learn all I can learn and be prepared. If I'm praying for the return of Messiah, should I not be made ready? Should I not be the 10 virgins that prepared and had plenty of oil, or should I be the ones unprepared?
Exactly. I would think everyone would want to be the ones that are prepared. And so I tell people, get your passports ready, because we're going to be heading to Jerusalem. His throne will be in Jerusalem. All nations, the United Nations.
That's exactly
Everyone's
right.
going to have to recognize that Jerusalem will be the throne for God's kingdom.
One of the things you have done in here that I compliment you for is that you see the prophetic significance of the Feast of Israel. Passover, of course, was the time that he was in Jerusalem for the 4 days of the inspection. And so if you truly understand the Passover and the days that passed and how to number those days, evening and morning and evening and morning, you find out that if you look at the biblical calendar of the 10th of Nisan, you're not concerned whether or not that's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You're concerned that it's the 10th of Nisan. If you look at the 14th of Nisan, you're not concerned whether or not that was a Wednesday or Thursday or a Good Friday. You're looking at the biblical calendar. Well, God has ordained in your first book, the 4 blood moons, that he uses signs in the heavens. He sets his calendar by the moon, the lunar cycle, because it is a predictable 28-day cycle. And there are 13 lunar months in the Hebrew calendar. So I know that much of your ministry has been spent in embracing what is commonly referred to as a messianic lifestyle or a messianic messaging. Uh, what brought you to the point of feeling that the broader church, the broader body of Messiah, was not? We don't write books to add one more to the pile. We write books to fill a void, to plug a hole, to convey a message that is not being conveyed. When you wrote this, you apparently observed that this was not the common thought in the Gentile believing community. And these observations were more gather together in a city for a large Passover Seder, but don't do it at church and don't do it at home, and that's the only one. Help my viewers understand the significance, if you will, of God's daytimer, of His plan, and what His purpose was in setting those dates as appointed times.
Sure. I believe that the word mikra, which is translated in our English Bibles as a convocation, which means an assembly, but it also implies a dress rehearsal. And so every year on Passover, they were doing the dress rehearsal of slaying the Passover lamb, because prophetically that was going to happen on that day. And then unleavened bread, He was buried. First fruits, He rose. On Shavuot is when the Spirit was poured out. And I tell believers, if you really believe that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, if He fulfilled all the spring feasts, not only to the day, but to the very hour of His first coming, He definitely would fulfill the fall feast to the day of His second coming prophetically. But again, I'm not setting dates. I'm not setting dates at all. I have no idea what year, but I do know that's the pattern. And so we need to be understanding from the Jewish perspective, prophetically, what's coming on the Feast of Trumpets. What does it stand for, or Yom Teruah? Same with Yom Kippur. What is the understanding of that? Same thing with Sukkot, or Tabernacles. So for me, there's a lot of Gentiles who are very interested in prophecy, but they don't have a compass. It's like being on a boat out on the ocean trying to understand where you're going. But if you understand God's daytimer, now all of a sudden, you have a compass, you have direction, you can have understanding. So for me, for the Gentiles, I wanted them to know they need to get on and recognize God's calendar. We're in the world, it says, but we're not to be of it.
Well, this is a summation of Leviticus 23,
Yes.
where God clearly states, and, I think it was probably Hallmark that did the most injustice to this by calling them the Jewish holidays.
Yes.
These are very specifically, especially if you're engrafted into the Commonwealth of Israel, you are a co-inheritor, you are you share in this commonwealth of Israel. Now, what's interesting to me is that the richness of each of these feasts are not only a foreshadowing, but when people talk about the last trumpet blast, they have no idea that there is such a thing as the last trumpet's blast. It is a part of a service, which is an observation of a feast day, of an appointed time. I find it interesting that there are 3 fall feasts, and I do believe He will return to fulfill those. But I also listen to His words when He says, tear this temple down, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Now, the natural mind, the Greek mind would say, well, you're talking about 1, 2, 3, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 3 days. And I'm thinking in my mind, maybe those 3 days are the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Trumpets, the trumpet blast, the Day of Atonement when all of Israel is saved, and then the celebration of the time in our temporary dwellings when God dwelt among us. Would that be the foreshadowing? Could that be the 3 days that He was talking about? Because certainly He did not rebuild the temple as they had expected. So it's a fascinating study. As you get feedback from people who have read this, and I know you celebrate the feast at El Shaddai Ministries. at your congregation. What has been the most dramatic, if you would, change in somebody's understanding of the Bible by having gone along with this timetable, gone along with God's day timer? What kind of revelations are people receiving after experiencing this?
It's been amazing. Like for our Passover Seder this last year, we had 1,500 people. We had pastors who would bring 50 or 70 members from their congregation, and the pastors are getting revelation. The people are getting revelation, and it's just astounding. And then on the Feast of Trumpets, we'll do the same thing. We'll have 1,500 to 2,000 people from all over coming, plus joining us online, and they just are blown away with the understanding of how important the days are. And for me, that's the greatest revelation, is the importance of being on God's calendar, why you need to have a biblical calendar that overlays the Gregorian calendar. I think that's the biggest revelation, is all of a sudden people realize the significance of understanding the biblical calendar and its relevance to Christians today.
You know, it's fascinating to me as a Jewish man that I hear about Pentecost, and I always hear the reference to Acts chapter 2. And I say, well, the first Pentecost was at Mount Sinai. It happened with Moses, and it happened 50 days after the Exodus. So Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, 7 weeks plus a day, 50 days, happened 50 days after the Exodus. The last Pentecost, if you will, happened 50 days after the resurrection. Wonder if they're the same day. On the day that Moses was given the law, the Jews were given the Spirit on the same day. When Moses came down the mountain and found that they were in defiance, 3,000 died. And when Peter came down the steps preaching the gospel, 3,000 were saved. And they were all on the same day. And the description given in Acts chapter 2 about the trumpet blast, about the tongues of fire and smoke, was exactly the description given in the Bible for why the people did not want to go up Mount Sinai with Moses, because the mountain was trembling and there was a loud trumpet blast and billows of smoke and fire. Tongues of fire were coming out from the presence of God. And the connections to being able to see that, number one, there was not a New Testament at the time of Jesus. Therefore, everything they were doing was according to God's appointed times, according to God's day timer. It's life-changing for so many. What were some of the challenges that you faced in writing this? Was it challenging, or was it just a summation of sermons you had done, or was it really something that you wrestled with, and how to present it to make sure that it did not give that sense that salvation comes through observance, or that salvation comes through that Judaizing message that Paul so eloquently wrote against? Because people don't understand, it wasn't Jews trying to make other Jews more Jewish. The Judaizers of the Bible were Gentiles trying to take on a Jewish identity, which would be in defiance to what God has created. What were some of the challenges you faced in writing this?
Well, the amazing thing is I started studying the feast back in the early 70s, but it was from a totally replacement theology perspective. Wow. And so, I understood how Jesus kind of fulfilled some of them, but my knowledge was completely limited. Gone to Bible college, taking classes on the feast. But like I said, totally from replacement theology. And then over the years, I kept studying. But in '93, my wife bought me a book by a Jewish rabbi on the Feast of the Lord. And that just really revolutionized my whole thinking. It's like, oh my goodness, now my eyes are opened in a whole new way, and I need to look at this over again. Mm-hmm. And so studying the feast, it's been a challenge over the last 30 years. 40 years just processing all of this and getting more understanding. And I've yet a lot to learn. But the challenging thing for me is exactly what you said. is how do I present this to people in a way that they understand? I'm not trying to Judaize anybody.
Right.
Gentiles should be happy being Gentiles. We're grafted in, we're one family. But we need to realize just how important this is. And so for me, like you said, the hardest thing was trying to write it in a way where people realize I'm not trying to Judaize or offend or make people Jewish. But I just want them to understand God's heart. He's dad. And if dad wants us to come to a party, who would want to go to a party thrown by God? That's the spirit of that.
There you go. There you go. And these are celebrations, and especially as believers, where the heaviness of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is such a burdensome stone around our necks. And Paul talked about that. He said, why do you put a burden on their backs that you yourselves cannot even bear under? And I remember as a kid going to synagogue all day long in the synagogue for all 4 and sometimes 5 parts of the service if I would make it to the Nila service. But as a child growing up in that, it was heavy. It was the music was like a dirge, a death march. And now as a believer, I get to celebrate the fact that my atonement's been made. This is a day of atonement that God had created for forgiveness. I've already received it. I can now celebrate it. And it became a time of dance and celebration for us, and the messages were lighter. They were clearly that I can't go back and make that sacrifice again. I can't go and place my hands on the goats for the sins of Israel, because it's already been done. It's already been taken care of. I can still pray for the cleansing of myself, but the sacrifice has been made, and the prophecy of the Day of Atonement has been fulfilled. That's God's plan. We're talking with Pastor Mark Biltz, author of God's Daytimer. If you're interested in learning more about the significance of these divine appointments, getting on God's calendar as opposed to your own calendar, I want to encourage you to really weigh into going to IANBN.com, Canadian Nation Broadcasting Network, going to Books and Media and clicking on this book. We're going to take a short break now. When we return, we're going to continue in this discussion about God's Daytimer, God's appointed times. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Revealing the Truth. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. We're talking about the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. We're visiting this segment with Pastor Mark Biltz, author of God's Daytimer, The Believer's Guide to Divine Appointments. Available through our website at ignitingnation.com or INBN.com. I'll get those initials down soon enough. And go to our Books and Media page and click on this book, God's Daytimer, for a deeper understanding. Mark, as I read Scripture, most people do not grasp the concept of the Sabbath. Constantine, by edict in 325 AD, changed the Sabbath from sundown on Friday to Sunday worship. And it was a man-made edict. God never changed the date. And as I shared earlier that I was on with Michael Onifer, we were kind of referencing some things about relationship. As I look at the 10 Commandments, and I look at the cross, I see Commandments 1, 2, 3, and 4 taking us right down to the cross piece. And the number 4 is right there at the cross piece. And then below the cross piece, 5 through 10. So the first 4 are about our relationship vertically with God. And we get that horizontal cross piece, which contains the Sabbath, both for our relationship with God, but then preparing us and equipping us for our relationship with man, that horizontal relationship. And the Sabbath is the most important of all of God's appointed times. It's the one that occurs a minimum and this should be startling to most of the listeners and the viewers, a minimum of 62 times a year. Not 52, but 62. Because of God's calendar. So when we understand that when God calls for a sacred assembly, and he says, do no regular work, that is a Sabbath unto God. So the fact that it occurs on average of 5+ times a month, and God gave it as a commandment, there must be something rich in our relationship with God in celebrating Shabbat, celebrating the Sabbath. You say on the back cover, you make the statement that this book will show you how to bring in Shabbat. Share with our audience, if you would please, why and how you should usher in the Sabbath.
Well, for me, I mean, going back to Genesis, God gave the Sabbath to Adam. So from the very beginning, it talks about how God set apart that seventh day of the Shabbat. He made it holy. And for many Christians, they say, well, for me, every day is a Sabbath. And I say, well, no, wait a minute. If everything is common, then nothing is holy. And so they have to understand, for God to make the Sabbath holy, you can't make it common and say every day's the Sabbath. And if you believe God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then you have to realize he would never change the Sabbath. And many Christians like to say, well, there's no command to keep the Sabbath in the New Testament. Well, hey, if we're supposed to do what Jesus did, he kept the Sabbath all through the Gospels. And it even talks about in the New Testament how Rabbi Shaul, or the Apostle Paul, would always go in on the Sabbath and reason with the Jews and the Gentiles who would come in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Many, many, many times we see the Sabbath was kept, and that's all they knew. If Yeshua would have done away with the Sabbath, he couldn't be the Messiah. Correct. I mean, it's that simple. And where it talks about the Apostle Paul preaching until midnight, well, that was Havdalah. That was just them meeting after the Sabbath and they're going in. It still wasn't necessarily Sunday. It may have been the first day of the week, but it was on Saturday night. They're closing out the Sabbath with teaching. And so Christians need to have a better understanding of just how important that the Sabbath is, and we need to recognize it for what it is. I mean, my goodness, God was merciful in giving us the Sabbath. It's not something legalistic. I mean, who wouldn't want a break? And not only who wouldn't want a day of rest, who wouldn't want a day of rest spending it with the Creator? So, I tell people, wow, don't knock it till you try it. We have so many people that come to our services on the Shabbat, many non-Jews, and after a while they just think, wow, the weekend actually seems longer. Everything seems so much better. And so for us, bringing in the Shabbat at sunset is just on Friday. You have to try it. That's all I can say. Try it. You'll like it.
Well, you're exactly right. It is not only is in the commandments, but it's also in God's appointed times. It begins with the Sabbath. And that's not to say, because Paul clearly wrote in Colossians, don't judge anybody by their new moon festival or their Sabbath observance. There's certainly a great deal of grace, but there's also a great deal of richness. And denying yourself the joy of the Lord, drawing a line in the sand that says, well, I'm not required to observe the Sabbath, so I'm just going to go to Sunday worship because that really is my custom. Your point is that don't knock it till you try it. Give it a chance. God created it for man as an opportunity for us to follow in his footsteps. For 6 days he worked, and on the seventh day he rested, and he gave us that gift of the Sabbath. Now what's interesting is that Jesus declares that he is the Sabbath. He clearly says, come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you Shabbat, rest. So when we look at the real intention of God's plan, it is not only to be forgiven, to receive the gift of salvation, it's also to enjoy the personal relationship and the gifts of God. It's like getting a gift and not opening it. It's there, you leave it unwrapped, and you might even know what's inside, you just do not avail yourself of it because you think you don't need it. But once you've immersed yourself in it and you realize that there is a separation between the profane and the holy, a separation between light and dark, a separation between work and rest, that you begin to understand that this Sabbath, not the 1 hour of church and then you go about and go to a ball game or go to a movie and go do this period of time is like an island in time. And that's what the ancient rabbis referred to it as an island in time. It was a place where you could go and worship and be at rest and finish and leave the work of the week and bring it to an end so that you weren't carrying it into the following week, that there was a separation. And it's refreshing, it's renewing, it's a blessing.
I was just going to say along that line, even when God told Moses about building the tabernacle, the first thing was they had to rest. The Sabbath took a priority over the building of the tabernacle. And in Leviticus 23, when it mentions the feast, the Sabbath is mentioned first.
Right.
And the other thing is concerning Colossians as well as Galatians 4. Many people misunderstand that. And so I just want to take a second to talk about those two verses there. Because Paul is telling the Colossians, don't let anyone judge you in the fact that you are keeping the Sabbath, that you are keeping the festivals. And in Galatians 4, where he talks about these foolish Galatians, why have you turned back to keeping, their pagan solar calendars, what he's talking about. The Galatians who didn't know God at all, who understood the biblical calendar, were going back to the pagan calendar, observing months and days and years. And so Paul is rebuking them for getting off the biblical calendar. And then he's praising the Colossians because they're staying on the biblical calendar.
It's an important part. We seem to have allowed, and sometimes I've been heard to say that Christianity is the worst thing that ever happened to the Bible and to Christ, because it's allowed us to drift away from God's original plans of God's way, and we replaced it with man's way. And the way we know that it's man's way is because it's so divided by denominations. People are fascinated when I tell them that the Shabbat candle is being lit every hour for 24 hours around the clock all over the world, at the very same prayers, the same liturgy that I would say for a Shabbat service is being said here in Central Time, an hour later in Mountain Time, an hour later in Pacific Time, an hour later and an hour later, and every hour for 24 hours. It's being continuously repeated, this celebration of the Sabbath. It begins at sundown, usually set by Jerusalem time, but around the clock, around the globe, it's universally celebrated. There is nothing in any other culture that really has steeped in not man-made tradition, but God-made tradition, according to God's appointed time. It's interesting, you and I preach on a Friday night or Saturday morning. The command is for us to do no regular work, but that happens to be our regular work.
Sounds like the Levites are the sons of Aaron.
There you go. So it's exactly right. This is a priesthood, and this is a part of that. Is that how can my people learn if there's no one to teach? You also talk about the Passover Seder. You do talk about Havdalah, Halakha, the Jewish laws of Halakha, which is the rabbinical, the walk, if you will. The word halak means to walk, so halakha means to walk in the ways of the Lord, to walk in the path of God. Can a person walk in the path of God and ignore a part of the Bible?
I don't think so. I mean, to me, he is the way, he is the truth, he is the life. Why would we want to walk any other way? The problem, as we see in the prophets all the time, is Israel kept walking according to their own thoughts, their own ways. And he says, return to the ancient paths in Jeremiah, which is the good way, and you'll find rest to your souls. That's what Matthew 11 is quoting, that verse. Our rest that we're going to find is through following God's ways, the ancient paths.
I completely agree with you. Culturally, people have adopted a lifestyle of Sunday worship. The families have grown up that way. How difficult do you think it is for people to embrace this? And this, of course, is not promoting in any way, shape, or form that you not go to church on Sunday. This is, in addition to, this is not a replacement theology of its own.
Right.
It is an encouragement for the believer to draw even closer to the Jewish Messiah, to draw closer to the Father's plan, who clearly says that these are my appointed times. And in fact, in portions of Leviticus 23, he talks specifically about the stranger among you, the sojourner, the one who lives with you. And certainly in today's common reference, that would be the Gentile, the non-Jewish person. So there are provisions here to take this out of the realm of the Jewish holidays and identify them clearly as God's appointed times. Do you see anybody struggling? Do you find it been challenging to people? Have you gotten feedback from people that are resistant to it? We always put ourselves out there, and we get the good reviews and the bad reviews and the compliments and what kind of response have you had? I know the book is doing well. As we say in Yiddish, Kanai Nahora. It's something that's be well, live long, be prosperous. But what kind of feedback are you getting?
Well, anyone can go to Amazon.com and read the reviews on the book, but they're almost all been positive. But obviously, I get a lot of negative reviews too, because again, as you said, they think we're trying to Judaize. They misunderstand what I'm saying, or they misquote what I'm saying. But I go to Sunday churches and teach all the time, all over the United States, all over the world, and they love it. Because one thing, I'm not a Torah terrorist, okay? And I'm sure you know what I mean by that. But I tell the non-Jews, look, in the temple, they had to worship every day. They had to do sacrifices every morning, every evening. There's nothing wrong with going to church on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. It just doesn't make it the Sabbath. But there's nothing wrong with going to church on Sunday. And, that's mostly what they want to hear. They want to know if I'm trying to put a guilt trip on it. But I say, look, you can still keep the Sabbath and go to church on Sunday. So I want people to recognize the appointed time, to recognize the Sabbath, and to keep it. But I don't cause a lot of conflict by bashing people for keeping or going to church on Sunday. But like you said, usually it's just for an hour anyway, and then it's off to do your own thing. It's not really a day of a Sabbath. It's more like an hour of what they constitute as the Sabbath. Right. But that's one thing that has helped me, is the fact that I don't go around, bashing people for going to church on Sunday. I tell them, hey, if the temple was here, we're going to meet every day of the week.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And people are surprised by that. They're surprised by the fact that when the millennial temple comes, that there will be daily sacrifices. There'll be every sacrifice that was made, with the exception of one, and that is the sin offering, because Jesus has already been our sin offering. Do you think that the average Christian understands that when they take communion, that they're actually observing the middle portion of the Passover Seder?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they do. For me, I think Yeshua didn't implement communion. He just was taking, when you do the Passover, remember me. But if people, want to take communion, I don't come against it per se, but as long as they use unleavened bread, not leavened bread.
Well, you're exactly right. It's interesting that the order of the communion, I guess it's the same way in all the churches, it's the bread first and then the wine. Is that correct?
What was that again?
What's the order of communion in the church?
Oh yeah, they take the bread first and then the wine. Right. Yes.
Right. Now in the Haggadah, the Passover Seder, it's always wine, cup, then matzah, cup, then matzah. So it's actually a portion, and it's a very specific cup. The cup of communion is a very specific cup. Can you share for just a few minutes on the four cups?
Well, sure, exactly. And the first cup would be the cup of sanctification, where we're setting everything apart, which also speaks of Israel being set apart from Egypt. And then you have the cup of deliverance, where God delivers them, breaks the chains from their bondage. But the thing is this, they need to realize they're still in Egypt. So even after God takes off their burdens from the cup of sanctification, he breaks their bondage, which spiritually speaking to our bondage to the world that we live in. Yes. We're still in Egypt. And so we need that third cup, the cup of redemption. And that's when the afikomen is coming out, which represents the Messiah, the communion, or whatever you want to call it. It's at the third cup, which is the cup of redemption. And that's what's so important. But then I tell people that even after the price has been paid, you're still in Egypt. You got to leave. And so that's why, we also have the fourth cup, the cup of acceptance, or the cup of hope, where God says, I accept you. I mean, it's one thing to deliver them out of Egypt and to pay the price, but he didn't dump them in the wilderness and leave them. He said, look, we're to be a family. I want you to, marry me, for heaven's sake. And so to me, that's what's so incredible, and why I think Christians should observe all four cups, which we see in Shemot 6, and 7.
Yes. It's quite interesting that communion represents that third cup, the cup of redemption. It is exactly at that point that the revelation comes. It is that point in that Last Supper, which was a Passover Seder, that he lifts the cup and says, this is the blood of the new covenant poured out for you. This is the cup, the third cup, that every church that has a table that says, this do in remembrance of me, are honoring the order of the Seder, the order of the events that took place, not only that night, but every year of his life, as we find him at age 12, making pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We find him at age 33, making pilgrimage to Jerusalem at Passover. It was the way of life, and the richness and it's not symbolism. And I want to make sure people understand that very clearly. This is not associated with symbolism. This is associated with the Word of God. These are specific instructions that are given for the observance of these appointed times. The shofar has tremendous significance for the Feast of Trumpets, the blowing of the shofar, taking us back to Mount Moriah and the redemption of Isaac, not by a lamb, but by a ram, caught in a thicket. A thicket's a thorn bush. So when I look at that ram, what is he wearing on his head but a crown of thorns? And so God is giving us these beautiful pictures. preparing the way for us to understand. We're talking with Mark Biltz, author of God's Daytimer, The Believer's Guide to Divine Appointments, brought to you by WND Books, a WorldNet Daily company. If you are looking to get as he says, sit back, put on your 3D Bible glasses, and come on an adventure that will radically change your life, I strongly recommend you go to our website at ignitingnation.com or IANBN.com and go to our books and media page and click on this book and get it. Get an understanding of God's appointed times, his appointment with you, which if he has an appointment with you, that means you have an appointment with him. So Mark Biltz, great to see you again. Glad to see you enjoying the fruits of your labor and the success of this book and the success of Blood Moons. What's next on the horizon for you?
Well, I am working on a couple of other books. One of the ones I'm working on is a book on the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, and how the festivals actually are tied into that as well. So we'll be looking at King Shlomo and taking a better look at the marriage of the God to his bride.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, we wish you great success. May the Lord bless all the works of your hand. Pastor Mark Biltz from Bonnie Lake, Washington, head of El Shaddai Ministries, author of The Four Blood Moons, and author of God's Daytimer. This wraps up our show for today with the WND Books authors and our discussion about Israel. We'll have a whole new slate of guests tomorrow to talk about parenting, family life, and we'll be talking with 3 authors and experts in the field of parenting. So until you tune back in tomorrow, I wish you shalom from all of us here at the Igniting Nation Broadcasting Network and from this program, Revealing the Truth. We'll see you tomorrow.